as somebody who loves their father, loves their brother, loves their husband, loves their male friends, I was kind of disgusted with the sort of discourse that seemed to be happening around men in liberal media. It increasingly became this sort of claim that men were somehow fundamentally wrong and that there was fundamentally some division between men and women. When you have entire governments and bodies and NGOs and schools panicking about Andrew Tate, you create allure and transgression, and that drew a lot of young men to watching those kind of videos. For the men that I've known who've killed themselves, it's the absence of a role. Contemporary feminism isn't feminism, but really is part of a kind of bigger attempt to erode the ties between men and women. Christianity absolutely loves and respects and understands women and children and men in their specificity. The contemporary world has forgotten all of the most important lessons about sexual difference that Christianity has always understood, so it can learn everything from it.
Welcome to Into the Truth, the podcast from the Catholic Truth Society. My name's Pierpaolo Finaldi, and CEO of CTS, and your host for this podcast. We're having a slightly different podcast today. We're here with a live studio audience, so say hello. And it's my very great pleasure to speak this evening to Nina Power. So welcome to the podcast. Nina is a writer, critic and philosopher, a former senior editor and columnist for Compact, and currently works with the New Culture Forum. Is that right? Mm-hmm. And she's the author of What Do Men Want? Masculinity and Its Discontents, which is the basic theme, the main theme for the podcast this evening. So again, welcome, Nina.
Thank you.
So tell us a bit about yourself, Nina. What's your kind of religious background, if any?
Well, I have to say I was brought up as a very liberal subject with atheist parents who are very loving. I love my parents very much. I would describe them as quite pagan. I grew up in the countryside, so they had a great love of God's creation, although they wouldn't describe it in that way. So, I think I was very much a liberal subject until probably about 5 or 6 years ago. And I am an Anglo-Catholic, so obviously the Catholic tradition within Anglicanism or High Church Anglicanism. So I'm not a proper Catholic, so I feel slightly, you're kind
of halfway there.
Halfway there, yes.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about, what was that moment 5-6 years ago that really sort of changed your outlook?
I think it was a series of things, partly a kind of disappointment, a kind of, a total collapse of what liberal values, which I don't really think exist exactly, meant. Also, I guess various personal, providential things. I met my now husband. We actually started going to Giles Fraser's church, and Giles was very brave because during the lockdown he kept his church open against the rules, like both the rules of the church and the rules of the land. And I think that was quite significant in the turning point for deciding to become baptized, because I hadn't even been baptized. So there was that. There was also a kind of whole series of ways of personal kind of problems, like I was cancelled, I lost lots of jobs, I lost lots of friends. Now, classic story for taking what I believe were truthful positions, and I still believe they're truthful positions on the reality of sexual difference, for example. I think a lot of people got done
up in that.
done on that one.
For answering that big question, what is a woman?
Well, yeah, that kind of thing. But I think before that, to be honest, there was a sense of, a kind of increasing feeling of godness, particularly in nature. And I think probably the more pagan background was part of that, just that kind of revelation of creation. And perhaps there is a slightly psychedelic aspect to this, but which is not very straight-laced.
Right.
As well.
But what would be called the sort of the second book of Revelation, the book of nature?
Yeah. So I don't know, a kind of feeling that being is good. That what God has created is good and that God is around us. And I see that in nature all the time and in other people. And I suppose just, this especially during lockdown. I suppose it was this idea that this is not reality. This is a kind of prison, in fact. That the way the state and everything is perceiving itself, right? This is not what's true. This is not God. This is actually taking us away from God. So it's a bit, but I think a lot of people who convert later on, their way into the church is often quite strange. And I do wish that sometimes the people who were lucky enough to be brought up Catholic or Christian were a bit, I don't know, less afraid of the stranger people who might come in through esoteric ways, No,
but I think I've often found that many of the most sort of interesting or original commentators on religious subjects have come in through these sort of slightly sort of idiosyncratic kind of journeys, and gives them that way of speaking about things in a slightly different way, giving new kind of seeing the truth from new angles, basically. I'm very interested in why. I mean, obviously, you got in trouble, especially about, I presumably about what a woman is in particular, because that does seem to be the big question the big hot potato that nobody wants to answer. But you ended up writing a book about particularly about men. So what was it that drew you to wanting to speak about that subject in particular?
I suppose it was partly like just my increasing horror, actually, at the way in which that discussion around men was going. As somebody who loves their father, loves their brother, loves their husband, loves their male friends, I was kind of appalled and, I don't know, disgusted with the sort of discourse that seemed to be happening around men in the kind of liberal media, but kind of it sort of, I don't know, flourished, or it's the wrong word. It sort of expanded in a bad way. And it increasingly became this sort of claim that men were somehow fundamentally wrong, and that there was fundamentally some division between men and women. And it was very weird because, I mean, I'm quite well read in like second wave feminism, and there was always this negative stereotype about feminists. Oh, they hate men, they're man haters. But I don't think a lot of them were, actually. Some of them probably were, but that kind of negative stereotype almost turned into like a positive thing. Oh, it's good to hate men, and this was encouraged all the time. Like, men are fundamentally, I don't know, violent. They're fundamentally suspicious. They're fundamentally, and it's bizarre because that was happening at the same time as the idea that the sexual difference wasn't real and didn't matter, but somehow men were to blame. And it just wasn't true. I just felt, well, this isn't true. This isn't true of my experience of men, the men in my life, who are wonderful. I mean, human, like we all are. But do you know what I mean? I didn't recognize what was being said about men at all. And Penguin had asked me to write a book about men a few years before I turned in the manuscript. And I think they actually really wanted me to write a polemic against men. And they were not very happy with the manuscript that I did, in fact, turn in, which was a kind of defense of men, and really a defense of the relationship between men and women and our kind of our social life and the mixed world in which we actually live.
Because, I mean, do you think that there was just this? I mean, I always sort of think about from my own perspective as a father of seven, and I always amazed at when I see fathers kind of depicted in the sort of general culture, and you get the sort of the Homer Simpson or the sort of Daddy Pig from Peppa Pig, where they're basically kind of morons, and they do everything wrong, and I mean, and that's actually sort of a quite that's without actually sort of saying that there's something kind of wrong with them or that they're kind of evil. They're just kind of incompetent. That's the sort of the good side. And then there's the actual sort of discourse that there's a problem with masculinity. So, I mean, was that the sort of the kind of things that you were seeing that you didn't like? Or
I mean, it's difficult not to go down a kind of more conspiratorial route on this, but I do think that there seems to have been perhaps a concerted effort to present men in extremely negative light, right? Either as incompetent, like you say, or stupid, irrelevant, or even something worse. That men were kind of fundamentally abusive or untrustworthy or things like this. And that was definitely something that's happened in my lifetime. I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't this discussion of men. And I think we still had a sort of reality principle that men and women existed. And I suppose one of the things I wanted to defend in the book was the kind of playfulness of that relationship, right? Which is, of course, predicated on the reality of male and female, from a religious perspective. And it's funny because the response to the book, I think Tim Stanley said, was very positive, but he said it was not religious enough. But then other reviewers were like, this is too religious. So it's, I tried to sort of do it subtly. And I was sort of becoming Christian as I wrote the book. So it's not a Christian book exactly. But it was definitely increasingly informed by my Christianity, right? And the kind of the creation of man and woman, but also my reading of Ivan Illich, in particular, who wrote this book called Gender, and he's a sort of strange, renegade, anarchist, Catholic
priest, isn't he?
Priest.
Yeah.
He was a priest, so he was
Right.
kind of excommunicated.
Yeah.
He's very critical of institutions, including the church, but I regard him as a fantastic Christian thinker. And he described that what he just calls the sad loss of gender, which he uses weirdly, but what he means is that the way in which, since the Industrial Revolution, the kind of separate spheres and the playfulness, the relationship between men and women kind of got converted into this idea of the worker, So I think there's almost a kind of economic explanation for like the presentation of men as redundant. There was this increasing narrative before the turning against men that men were redundant somehow because the economy had changed and we were now just doing knowledge and service work and we'd moved from industry and therefore men were like not so important, which is absolute nonsense, but that was being kind of pushed, I think.
So, I mean, one of the things that gets spoken about hugely is, this word patriarchy, whether you have to smash it or whether it exists at all. I mean, what's your take on that sort of word and the discourse around it?
Yeah, well, I did actually draw on biblical ideas in the book because I wanted to say that whatever the contemporary use of patriarchy or patriarch was a misunderstanding, as if there was some sort of zero-sum game in which there was a structure in which men have all the power and women have no power, and men are sort of parasitically taking things from women or something like this. And but really, I think the point about patriarchy is about responsibility and duty, and actually, like, as you say, being a father, well, it's actually about taking care and taking responsibility. It's not about taking things or having things. It's actually really onerous. And again, I think there was this sort of attempt to say, well, to get rid of duty for everyone, actually, partly as a consequence of the sexual revolution, which really only benefited like cads, And I think the cad has always been with us, right? But the cad is not the role model. The cad should not be the role model for men, right? And Louise Perry, who I'm very close to, obviously did a very good job taking apart the kind of the sort of promises of the sexual revolution and actually pointing out how bad it is in reality for men, women and children. So yeah, the patriarch is someone who takes responsibility, a man who takes responsibility.
I mean, you were talking about this, the problem of the industrial revolution in particular, and I mean, is it a question? Is it a purely kind of economic question, or is it a question of getting rid of kind of gender differences for kind of other reasons as well? Yeah,
I mean, it's a complicated question, right?
Yeah.
Sort of how the social and the economic and the religious as well all play into one another. But I think once you sort of strip both men and women of certain roles and you create this idea of the worker and this kind of new economic subject, in which sex becomes relatively indifferent, right, at the level of certain kind of jobs, then you kind of lay the ground for the idea that sex is less important or less significant, which you can create then sort of new subjects like the consumer or whatever, and then identity and all of those things that we got later.
I mean, I was quite interested in your description of your own background, because I mean, now, if you want to speak about sort of masculinity, you have to go back to a sort of, some sort of traditional roles. And that tends to be a discourse that exists within a kind of religious discourse or a sort of political discourse as well. But presumably that none of that was in the sort of the roles that you saw kind of growing up, etc. So, where did you see, I mean, what do you think kind of formed the masculine roles, even in a sort of non-traditional or non-traditionalist and kind of religious household? Was it just a sort of a leftover from a kind of, religious society, or do you think it was something else?
I think partly because I would say in many ways my parents are very Christian, right, in their outlook, in their civility, in the way that they treat their neighbours, their environment, and they're extremely kind of generous and thoughtful people, and so on, right? I'm very fortunate to have this kind of parents. And but some of it, I think, was residual cultural Christianity, for sure. And I think since the 60s, and they're baby boomers, so I think, and they lived in the countryside, so maybe it's easier to hold on to older values. So yeah, that I think there was a residual Christian culture, which we do still have. I mean, there's endless questions about whether we have an inverted Christian culture, or whether certain bits have been extended in weird ways, or whether it's completely heretical, whether it's completely, do you know what I mean? It's a sort of endless discussion about what remains of Christianity in non-explicitly Christian secular culture. But I think, we still owe a lot of our conceptions to Christianity. So, but I think in terms of role models and so my father actually never met his father. So he was a man who grew up with a single mother, which was quite rare then and quite scorned, had to kind of develop his own version of being a good man. So really the book is ultimately about what it means to be a good man and a good woman, and to say that this is what is not being represented, right, in terms of our role models and so on, and that question of virtues and values. So I would say my father was indeed, he took great care of us. He was very patient. He was very generous, as he is to everyone. I mean, it's difficult when people start saying, well, what are the specific virtues? And then people get upset when you say, well, are there virtues specific to men and virtues specific to women? Right? I think there are, but most of them are overlap.
Right.
Right? I think most of the time we need to have the same virtues or practice the same virtues. Of course, we're not perfect, but do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But there may well be indeed specific virtues for each sex. So in many ways, yes, it was sort of not traditional. My father made the food, for example, very badly, but very charmingly, because my mother was working and so on. And I think he regarded himself, because he was brought up by his mother, as a feminist in lots of ways. And he was always encouraging me to sort of don't be held back by being a girl or whatever. Which was the line then, as opposed to you're automatically a girl boss or whatever. Yeah. So I think residual Christianity and just the luck of having good parents with good character.
I mean, it's been interesting to see that the backlash against people speaking about things like toxic masculinity has meant that people have there have been various people who have kind of stood up and offered a vision of what it means to be a man, and not all of them have gone back to kind of the traditional kind of Christian view of masculinity and patriarchy in particular, but have gone in sort of a different direction. And I mean, here we're talking in particular about the what's come to be known as the Manosphere, which I'm kind of interested whether that's really a very specifically sort of online phenomenon, or whether it could have happened without it. But it'd be interesting to get your sort of take on what the Manosphere has sort of come from, and what have been the kind of main exponents of it. and whether it can be saved at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are various directions in which a kind of dissident masculinity took root. I mean, one of which I'll just get out of the way was men going their own way, which was a kind of male separatist movement, which is quite interesting. So I tried to look at that in parallel to the kind of feminist separatist.
It was called sort of MGTOW or
yeah,
something.
so men going their own ways, or MGTOW. It was a pretty small movement, to be honest, but it was men who described themselves as red-pilled, which is to say, like, they've understood the truth of reality and decided that pursuing women was just a money drain and that there was no point in kind of engaging in heterosexuality. They were not homosexual either. They were just not interested in
actual women.
In actual women. Well, I think in many cases they might have had a bad experience with women and then generalized to all women, right? So you get a lot of those kind of generalizations, as you do with the kind of toxic masculinity thing, or all men bad, all women bad, and so on. I mean, it's very black and white. But I think probably the more dominant manosphere trend, which then caused a lot of worry and concern, as we see with like Prevent and adolescents and so on, people getting very upset about images of masculinity that were maybe more hierarchical, more kind of non-Christian in the sense of being like, this is about power, this is about men being strong and working out and so on. There's nothing wrong with men working out. Obviously, I think it's a good thing to try to be healthy and to look after our bodies. But that sort of thing became very right-coded, which is, again, weird because when I was growing up in sort of more liberal thing, it was really the liberal people who were worried about food and health because they were suspicious of like big pharma and cheap food. Do you see what I mean? So it's much more kind of hippie-ish to be like in the 80s and 70s. But then for some reason that stuff all got really right-wing coded, you know, and silly Guardian pieces about how exercising makes you a fascist or something. I mean, just like ludicrous. But but I think so the difference between the kind of the Christian right and the non-Christian right, I mean, you could call it, I don't know, the Nietzschean right or something like this, is, well, first of all, a discussion about souls, because we believe that everyone has a soul. They don't necessarily believe that everyone has a soul. And I think also their commitment to hierarchy as manifested in the world, right? That this is a material instantiation of hierarchical difference, and that would include the superiority of men over women in some ways. But I think that...
But that was sort of based on kind of power, essentially, strength.
Yeah, a sort of idea of power, many different ways of thinking about it. But I think the backlash to it, unfortunately, made it more attractive, if you see what I mean, because when you have entire governments and bodies and NGOs and schools panicking about Andrew Tate or whatever, and no respect for Andrew Tate, I think he's a terrible human being, but you create allure and transgression, you know, so they did not handle this well at all. And that drew a lot of young men into to watching those kind of videos, you know, and which do contain a kernel of truth. This is the reason why they're effective, because some of the truths that were not allowed to be spoken in the kind of liberal environment were being spoken and then kind of taken in unpleasant directions in the sort of manosphere, as it were.
Yeah, because I mean, would it be possible maybe for those who are not sort of locked into the online discourse, sort of give a little bit of a summary of what, you know, maybe that kind of Andrew Tate style sort of idea of masculinity is?
I suppose it's an idea that men are kind of inherently dominant and domineering, and that their job is and that the women are kind of chattel or people to be manipulated. I mean, Andrew Tate did apparently convert to Islam. I mean, there's a kind of, I'm not sure he was particularly devout. He may not be Muslim anymore, but I suppose it's this idea that there's almost like a celebration of polygamy as well. You know, the idea that men deserve more than one.
Well, there's certain types of men, sort of, you know, kind of alpha males that deserve everything that they can get. Basically.
And it's, I mean, worse than that, it's a kind of pimp model, right? I guess that sort of men like Andrew Tate sort of deserve to control women and make money off them and manipulate them and so on. And this is how you express your masculinity, is through kind of force and domination.
But I mean, that I think that's all true, that what you're saying there. But if that were all it was, it would be kind of odd that he's become so popular, because those are sort of repulsive ideas to, I think, the vast majority of people. But there's something else going on which seems to be sort of get people interested, which is probably more kind of reasonable, or more what people are kind of looking for. What would you say kind of that is?
Well, I suppose that the kernel of truth would be to say, well, men and women are different, right? Well, and first of all, even to acknowledge that there is sexual difference. I mean, this is also one of the problems with this sort of liberal madness, and I was on the left, and up until I don't know, quite a long time at this point, I wouldn't necessarily say everything is political in that way, but definitely the point at which, how to put it, the reality of sexual difference stopped being important for the left. And these was people who were supposed to be kind of historical materialists, looking at the way in which, class and sex interacted over time. And they just kind of gave up on all of that. And they were no longer materialist, apparently. They were kind of completely idealist. No, these are just ideas that anyone can join. So I think, in the first place, all you have to do to counteract that and to seem attractively oppositional is to restate basic truths.
Right.
So that's a problem. Okay. Because the moment anyone says, well, okay, here's some reality, and you go, yeah, of course, then you're kind of like already in that frame. So, yeah, I think talking about sexual difference already puts you sort of in a intriguing position, right? Especially for young people, if they're being told, well, you can't discuss these things, or you're being offensive if you use these words or whatever.
So the very fact that the one wasn't allowed to kind of point out the obvious, it allowed people like Andrew Tate to become, basically sort of speaking truth to the kind of craziness of the world.
Yeah, and I think if you're a young man and you're constantly being told that your masculinity and your way of behaving is somehow wrong, then of course you're going to look to someone who says, no, you're being oppressed by this, ridiculous system that is trying to crush your energy. So I think we did see a lot of that, right? The idea that young boys' behavior was somehow aberrant and they needed to change who they were even as children, which is...
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting kind of area, because one of the things that sort of people who've been studying outcomes, especially for boys in school and to a certain extent in the workplace as well, have noticed that basically it's the boys who have been sort of getting worse and worse, and their exam results have been getting worse, school attendance, even general kind of mental health, earnings, all of those things have been kind of on a downward slope. So I mean, what do you think? I mean, that's something that you kind of spoke about in the book. So what do you think has been really the and where has it been worse in terms of the mental health and achievement for young boys in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's broadly speaking the absence of a role, and then people telling you off for who you are. I mean, this is obviously going to make you, first of all, unhappy, and then probably quite angry. I mean, I wrote quite a lot about male suicide, which is obviously very high. It tracks my generation, Gen X, really badly for some reason. I think my generation was oddly had high suicide rates when we were younger, and now it tracks us. We have the highest suicide rate as well, and I don't know why that is. Maybe a lot of drugs and alcohol, maybe a kind of weird hedonic moment in the 90s, like the end of history. I don't know. There's all kinds of strange reasons why that's happening. But I think, for the men that I've known who've killed themselves, I think really it's the absence of a role, the absence of a place to act in the world, a feeling of kind of uselessness in front of the cosmos, and I think that for men acting in the world is kind of crucial, to put it very simply, right? To see your work reflected back in the world, from the world. And it doesn't mean that every man has to have a family. It doesn't mean that every man has to achieve anything. But I think when those things are kind of completely cut off, or they appear not there, then you're...
Or kind of demeaned as well.
Yeah, and then you're just sort of demeaned by virtue of your very existence. I mean, it's like telling people off for who they are. I mean, it's absurd. The idea that men are somehow fundamentally wrong for existing. It's like, well, they do exist. I mean, that's just reality. I mean, the opening line, I mean, it sounds so simple, right? It's so obvious what I'm saying, but I mean, the opening line of my book is men and women exist, right? Full stop. I had to fight Penguin to keep this line in my book. I'm not joking. For a long time, people were trying to cancel the book, people both inside Penguin and outside. And my editor at one point was like, could you please just get rid of that opening line? And I said, no, absolutely not. And then she said, can you include men, women, and people of other genders exist? I said, no, absolutely not. So, I mean, it's so stupid. It's so ridiculous that we're at this point that we have to say, to fight to say something so blatantly, obviously true that the entirety of human history, humanity understood until apparently 5 minutes ago.
Mm. But I always wonder, like, what do people who, don't even want to say that men and women exist, I mean, where do they think that we're kind of getting to? Is it we could get to a place where you don't say that and things will be better? Or...
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's lots of different things going on, one of which is a sort of horrible transhumanism. Partly I think there's a kind of idealism, partly it's kind of gender ideas, partly I think it's just confusion. I think people got so worried about attaching roles and so on to sex that they kind of went mental and said, well, if you and weirdly, it's much more regressive, right? If you say, well, you're a girl and you like cars, therefore you must actually be a boy. Because I think when we were growing up, actually we got to this interesting point where it's like kind of indifferent to people's interests, right? It's like, well, you're a girl, but you like Dungeons and Dragons. That's fine. You're a boy and you're more interested in fashion. That's fine. Do you know what I mean? And then that kind of got really twisted, and then it became, well, no, you must really be a boy if you like things that boys like, which is crazy.
Yeah. Which has been what had been argued against for decades before that. A very strange kind of turn of events.
Right, and I think, look, I mean, if most boys like cars and trucks and so on, that's great. It doesn't matter. Do you know what I mean? And I think this idea of like social reprogramming, we can get girls and boys to like the opposite thing for no apparent reason.
I mean, one sort of role which obviously is very much tied to kind of masculinity is the role of fatherhood, and I think it's interesting that this kind of crisis has been sort of growing. Many people were growing up without fathers. So, I mean, what was your sort of take on kind of fatherhood in general in the book?
Well, I'm very pro it, obviously. But, I would just say anecdotally, my brother, who was a very irresponsible young man, when he did finally become a father, he changed completely. I mean, it made him a man, and he's an incredibly responsible, loving father now in a way that I find stunning, having known him as a teenager and in his 20s, because he was terribly selfish and badly behaved. So I think fatherhood is very good for a lot of men. I think motherhood is very good for a lot of women. I think, one of the tragedies is when you listen to young people say that they can't start a family. I think this is one of the saddest things I ever hear. This is absolutely brutally tragic. We need a society which absolutely encourages people to do that, whilst also having room for the odd strange people like myself who can't or won't have children, and not treating them weirdly either. You know what I mean? And of course, religion had a solution for this. But I think the real issue I have is with the state, because the state has taken away all of those kind of family, community, church responsibilities where people would look after each other and there would be a kind of network and community, and replaced it with this inhuman behemoth where the incentives, let's say, financial for being a single mother are greater than staying with the father of the child, right? Which is absolutely abhorrent as a kind of social incentive, you know. So this encourages the idea that the state is daddy and mummy, in fact, and the state is not. The state is an inhuman bureaucracy, you know. But you know what I mean? Like that kind of, it's really, really contributed to the erosion of social ties and those bonds.
You know, it's very interesting what you say, almost as though fatherhood makes the man. And, you know, as we see in a society where, you know, birth rates are plummeting, and I think, the Gen Z is the first generation where the majority of people sort of say they don't want children. You know, we are getting to a place where we might end up with a generation where more than half never even reach that stage of being made into a man by fatherhood.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm interested to move on to kind of feminism in general. Modern feminism is often blamed for the challenges facing men today. Is that a kind of criticism that you recognise? I mean, you were obviously quite kind of well versed in the sort of general the sort of progression of feminism, and I mean, is there a feminism which kind of allows men to flourish, or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But it's also the bits of the second wave that are now completely verboten and you're not supposed to really read.
Right.
So, I mean, my favourite second wave feminists tend to be the kind of wacky nature feminists who are very committed to sexual difference, you know, in the kind of goddess way and so on. I mean, so there is a kind of interesting discussion, dialogue with religion, Christianity. Many of those feminists are very critical of what they saw as the church's suppression of women and kind of women's myths and so on. But I think they were serious scholars, if you see what I mean. Like they were looking at reality and history and so on. And I mean, there are outliers like Camille Paglia and so on who say who absolutely defends the difference between men and women and so on. So it's not one thing, if you like. And I mean, I am friends with people like Erika Patriarchy and kind of Catholic feminists. I think there's an interesting, lots of very brilliant kind of female scholars working within a kind of Catholic feminist tradition, which, you know, it's a fine line to tread in some ways, particularly in very kind of, I don't know, more traditional Catholic communities. So yeah, I mean, there are things like I'd never heard of like marital debt, things like that, which I suppose as a former liberal person is like a little bit shocking. Not gonna lie, but
you don't hear about it much in the Catholic Church either, to be honest with you.
No, but you know, so obviously there are different ways in which this is enacted. But yeah, I mean, obviously we hear a lot feminism is to blame. I think that contemporary feminism isn't feminism, and I actually argued this years ago, 2009, before I was a Christian or anything, because I could see it was just a kind of propaganda consumerist thing, and had nothing to do with reality, particularly. It was more about selling things to people. But I think since then it's become much more sinister. You know, I think there is a faux feminism which is sold as emancipation and the smashing the patriarchy and so on, but really as part of a kind of bigger attempt to erode the ties between men and women, right? I mean, you look at countries like South Korea, which has the lowest birth rate of any country in the world, and the men and women are more or less segregated. I mean, they don't encounter each other anymore. I mean, this is so bizarre. I mean, that there's no playfulness, there's no interaction, there's no dialogue. I mean, what is going on here? Like, and who benefits from this strange, segregated world? I mean, it's a terribly sad world.
I mean, I'm interested in this word playfulness that you've mentioned a few times and comes up quite a bit in the book. I'm interested to see what do you kind of mean by that? And I think I get what you mean. I don't know, is that just on the sort of the dating scene, should we say, which has become so sort of fraught with pitfalls and dangers that is that the sort of playfulness that you're talking about, or is it?
Yeah, but I think it's kind of deeper. It's sort of like the acknowledgement of sexual reality and like being at ease with it, right? And I don't just mean flirtation or sexually or whatever. I mean just a kind of wearing one's sex both seriously and lightheartedly, right? So that there is a kind of back and forth, right? That is part of a recognition of the opposite sex. And I think all of those things have been crushed. I mean, people used to meet their spouse at work, and now you get to go to HR if you say something nice to someone. I mean, it's absolutely, the real.
That's a nice dress, right?
Right. No, exactly. So I suppose I mean that kind of ease of casualness of what I call heterosociality, which is the fact that we live in a mixed world. And actually, it's much nicer if we get along together, and that can be quite light-hearted. And I think the sexual revolution, unfortunately, has created this sort of terror. I think it's turned into the terror, right, in the French Revolutionary sense. We're in the sexual terror phase where, yes, not only are transgressions like perceived everywhere, but they're kind of hallucinated, and then everyone becomes kind of terrified. So that you can't have that sort of lighthearted, just getting along thing so easily, So I think we need to bring back playfulness somehow.
I wondered also whether it was about the kind of inherent sort of humour of the difference, of sexual difference. Yeah.
No, totally. Like, isn't it funny? Like,
that we see each other. So and that we see each other. We see things so differently in some ways, which is almost something that you can't kind of say.
Yeah.
It's not just it's cliche because it's kind of true in a sense.
Yeah, and I mean we used to have all of these kind of rituals for acknowledging these things. I mean whether it was sort of dancing or where the acknowledgement of the role was kind of culturally made manifest, right, into these sort of beautiful performances and these beautiful rituals. And I think those are all sort of smashed. We don't have an homogenous culture. We have a very libidinous culture where people can sort of do whatever they want whenever they want. There isn't sort of that kind of stages of life or community that would bring people together to do similar things at similar times, which would be this playful acknowledgement of the humor, cosmic humor.
And kind of different interests and different spaces as well, or different, I don't know. I think I remember Mary Harrington at one point talking about this kind of strange sort of male spaces, like what was it, metal detecting or something like that. I think she uses as this kind of weird thing where they sort of all stand 10 meters away from each other and barely speak, but then have a great day or whatever.
No, perfect. No, I think there's been altogether too much proximity. And I actually think the proximity is a problem because we shouldn't know this much about each other. It's much more like mysterious and interesting when we regard the opposite sex as like somehow different and intriguing. And I think, the sort of social world and the lack of segregation in certain respects has kind of destroyed some of the mystique. So we should go back to some segregations, fine.
What do you think contemporary society can learn from the Catholic understanding or the Christian understanding between of the relationship between men and women?
Yeah, I mean, I think an awful lot, because I think the kind of Catholic anthropology and the Christian anthropology is fundamentally true, because I think it's also been worked out over sort of, hundreds and thousands of years. And I think, fundamental to at least my understanding of Christianity is also the recognition of the inevitability of social harm and social awkwardness, which we all commit and we all receive. And I think that kind of forgiveness actually is fundamental to me. And I don't see very much forgiveness in our contemporary world at all. we have a world that has, on the one hand, is very liberal and people can do what they like. But obviously, if people transgress, even unwittingly, they're then kind of punished forever. And there seems to be very little flexibility and forgiveness in that world. So yeah, sorry. So what can we learn from the kind of I think it's much more realistic. I think it's just much truer. I think Christianity is the only major religion, possibly the only religion, that takes women and children in their difference and values them in their difference. I think it without making it a question of hierarchy or dominance or ownership or possession. And I think Christianity absolutely loves and respects and understands women and children and men in their specificity. And it does so in all of these very beautiful and complicated ways, whether it's through the saints, whether it's through Mary, whether it's through the Trinity. The contemporary world has forgotten all of the most important lessons about sexual difference that Christianity has always understood. So it can learn everything from it.
So what do you think, though? What do you think those are? Those sort of most important lessons?
I think partly that women are also fundamental to Christianity. I mean, they see Christ's resurrection. They are there throughout. That they are equal and loving partners with Christ and in the religion from its very foundation. So that women have this, different but equal role, right?
So in a sense, that sort of discourse about women being placed to the margins or oppressed by religion, it has been a sort of work of kind of propaganda in a sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a narrow and mean understanding of the reality, and certainly when I look at my Christian friends, whether they're Anglo-Catholic or Catholic, their relationships, they often have larger families, they often are married, quite soon after they meet. These are very functioning and healthy and wonderful relationships. And clearly something is working here, right? I hate to use this mechanical language of work, but, they are clearly flourishing relationships where people are respected as individuals, but as also part of a family who is faithful, who go to church together and so on. And so it just seems to be the best the best way of living and the best the best image of faith. I think liberalism does not have an image. It doesn't have a positive image of men or women. It has something else, which is the libidinal subject or the desirous subject or the individual who is not particularly male or female. And I think we are fundamentally male or female. So
when you say the libidinal subject, what do you mean by that?
The subject that desires, and that desire is fundamentally good, and that society should be there to give you what you want, and that
and it's kind of no desire is sort of off limits as long as it can be fulfilled, without harming them. Right.
So you have the harm principle, but basically, the idea would be that what makes you who you are is your desire, right? Which I think is fundamentally untrue. And I think a lot of desires are very bad for people and bad for the social whole.
But it tends to be very good for sort of an economy, basically,
Right. And I mean,
consumers.
Sure, and I think we've gone down this kind of quantitative world of measurement, and the idea that the economy is more important than people. I mean, markets should be subsumed to people's needs and wants, not the other way around.
So you've spoken about restoring a positive understanding of the patriarchy. I mean, I'd be interested to know if you think is it a word that we can rescue, and also, what does a positive understanding of the patriarchy kind of look like?
Well, like I say, I think it goes back to this idea of responsibility, because I think one of the other problems with liberalism or modernity is the idea that the state gives you rights, and that's the mechanism of duty, whereas actually we have duty to each other all the time. And I think duty has become a sort of dirty word. You know, it's like, well, I don't want to do something, therefore why should I? Right? But actually, obviously, being a father involves all kinds of duty and care and protection and so on. So it's in that sense that I think patriarchy is like, yeah, I mean, needs to be protected or resurrected or, you know, defended or enacted. And I suppose one of the points of the book is like to say, well, actually, enormous numbers of men are doing this all the time already. That they might be being ignored and neglected and actually misrepresented. But this is the reality of men who love and take responsibility for their families, for example. So it is already happening. It happens all the time.
So just a sort of final question, what practical advice would you give to men seeking out to live a sort of traditional Christian vision of masculinity today?
Ignore 95% of the world. Well, if they are fortunate enough to be a member of a church and to have kind of friends who are Christian and so on, I think it would be to I don't know, like practice a sort of religious life that might see you at odds with the world, you know, that might see you at odds with the propaganda, and to develop kind of character and interests. I mean, this was something that was still important in the 90s. It was like, how do you become a person? Well, you have interests and character. You weren't an identity. Like, what even is that? So I think this kind of development of one's religious and I don't know, curious life, you know, the fact that we have certain aptitudes and interests and so on, and just keep doing that, like against the world. Somehow. Sounds quite Gnostic. But
Great. Well, so thank you so much for that, Nina. It's been a fascinating discussion. Lots to think about there. Where can people find your writing, or, you know, the stuff that you're working on at the moment?
So I guess on Substack, just under my name, I do book reviews for The Telegraph here and there, and The Critic and various other places.
Well, thank you so much, Nina.